Hi everyone, and welcome to your first week of lecture. For our class, this week we are going to be talking about family relationships and health. Now, when we talk about families, people can mean a lot of different things. So the word family might immediately call to mind the picture of a mother and father and two kids, but we mean family much more broadly than that. So when we talk about family, it could be your nuclear family, so family that you have biological or legal ties to, but family can also be families of choice. Families can be formed in a lot of different ways. So think about the word family very broadly this week as we talk. Families can impact health in a lot of different ways. So for example, family interaction and communication is related to a lot of different behaviors in adolescence, like substance use, disordered eating, risky sexual behavior. Family communication can be related to things like how and whether and when people disclose that they have illnesses, or can be related to things like how an illness progresses. So even though we're going to talk just about a couple of different things today, remember that family communication can impact health in a lot of different ways other than what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to focus today on the idea of family stressors. Stress comes from change in the environment, and as you probably know, families can evolve and change over time. Stress can come from positive or negative events. So a positive event might be something like having a baby, or more negative events like losing a job. So anything that changes the status quo of the family. But we're going to talk today mostly about stressors that we would say are negative. So you can see on this slide that family stressors can be either developmental or they can be unpredictable. So those two italicized words are two different types of stressors. When we talk about developmental stressors, we mean that those are normative stressors or stressors that are part of the human developmental process. So stressors that are developmental are predictable, they are expected life events, but that doesn't mean that they're not stressful. So some examples could be things like death of an aging parent, or launching children from the nest, or retirement from the workforce. So those are things that are expected in the life course, but they're still pretty stressful. Other stressors are unpredictable, so we call those non-normative stressors. Those are unique sets of circumstances that the family doesn't anticipate, and so they're probably unprepared for that. So some examples of unpredictable or non-normative stressors would be things like natural disasters, illness, disability, losing a job. And then there are some things that are somewhere in between. So they're not developmental, but they're also not unpredictable. So divorce, for example, is pretty common, and you're going to learn quite a bit about how divorce impacts the family this week in your readings. So it's pretty common, but people don't necessarily expect it. So it's not really developmental. It's not really unpredictable. The real question that we kind of want to think about this week, and that you can talk about in your discussion or think about as you do your readings or do your self-reflection, is that some families experience stress and crisis and people thrive. People actually do really well during those stressful times. But for other families, it really knocks them off track and their functioning diminishes. So as examples, as we think through these issues, we're going to talk about two stressors and how families manage them. The first stressor that we're going to think about is caregiving. So caregiving happens when one family member is caring for the other one. And this can happen in a lot of different ways. So it could be that a parent is caring for a child who has a disability or who has some kind of chronic illness. But what we're going to focus on today is a different and sort of unique set of circumstances, which is when middle-aged adults, so people in their 40s, 50s, somewhere in that range, sometimes early 60s, care for their aging parents. So this can be particularly stressful because middle-aged adults, those people in their 40s and 50s, are often caught between the needs of their children and their aging parents. So people who are in their 40s and 50s, people who are middle-aged, often still have children in their home. Their children haven't launched from the nest yet, and so they're caring for their kids at home. They're also caring for parents who are aging. So this can heighten concerns about things like mortality. It can make people evaluate their choices in terms of their values, in terms of their careers, in terms of their mate selection. So if somebody is caring for an aging parent and their spouse or their mate isn't being very helpful, it can make people really stressed about their choice of who it is that they're with. So there's a lot that people balance when they are a middle-aged adult caring for a parent, but also caring for their child. So everybody in the family is affected by this. So you obviously have the middle-aged adult who's trying to balance all of the different roles that they have. So maybe roles at work, roles in the family, other roles outside of the family. But you also have the children at home who have some concerns. So things like hormonal changes in adolescence, and that can impact the experience for the middle-aged adult, for their parent. But also the adolescent is going through a really important developmental time. And if their parents' attention is sort of torn in all these different places, that can be very stressful. The aging parent also has some concerns. So their aging issues could affect things like their mobility. It could affect things like their memory. And so you have some sort of unique characteristics there. You can also see on this slide that this can be especially stressful for women. So there are some gender effects when we talk about middle-aged adults caring for aging parents. So women tend to take on more caregiving tasks than men do. Women are affected by their adolescent children's experiences more than men are. But women are not emotionally affected as much by their relationships with their parents. The opposite is true for men, where men are more emotionally affected by their relationships with their parents, but are less affected by the concerns of their adolescent children. Men are also more affected by any kind of strain on the marriage than women are. And we don't exactly know what the reason for that is, but we do know that there are some challenges that are unique depending on people's gender. So that's one stressor that we would consider this to be a developmental stressor, because caring for an aging parent is something that is expected in the life cycle, but it's still very, very stressful. A second stressor that we're going to talk about is childhood illness or disability. So this is one that is an unpredictable stressor. This is non-normative, so this way you have an example of each of those different types of stressors. But childhood illness or disability is an example of a stressor that's unexpected in the life cycle. And we're talking about when a child has a major illness or disability, not things like staying homesick with the flu. So we're talking about major, potentially life-threatening illnesses and permanent disabilities. So when we talk about these things, there are a lot of different issues to consider with the family and how this is stressful for the family. So one way that scholars have learned about dealing with childhood illness or disability is looking at some different stages that families go through when they're coping with a childhood illness or disability. And you may be familiar with this kind of stage model. It's a little bit similar to the stage model of grief, so how people go through stages when they're grieving. But these stages are a little bit different. So when a child is diagnosed with an illness, there are stages that people in the family may go through. These stages are not predictive, so it's not meant to say if a child has an illness, this is what you're going to experience. But instead it says this is often what happens, but not necessarily what should happen. So if people skip a stage, there's nothing wrong. Not everybody experiences all of these. And people may not necessarily go in this order, or they may cycle back around to different stages. So think of this as sort of a loose explanation for how people deal with a childhood illness. So the first stage you can see here at the top is impact. This starts with the diagnosis of the illness or disability and is often characterized by anxiety and shock. So the family is very surprised often. So in this stage, the impact stage, they're trying to get information, they're trying to learn about what's happening. And here, in terms of their communication, they're very focused on the child and focused on the illness or on the disability. So seeking support is very typical in this stage, but there are also families that may withdraw and become very isolated in this stage. So here they may want to just sort of isolate and focus inward on what's happening in the family. The second stage, right under impact, is denial. Here, it's very common for people to avoid their feelings, to try to control their anxiety and disbelief. So they might either be in denial that the diagnosis is correct, and so they may want to get a lot of different opinions because they're in denial that this is right. Or they might just deny that the diagnosis is permanent. And so they might think this is just a temporary thing. So they might think, for example, yeah, my kid hasn't been keeping up, or my kid may have this or that symptom, but this diagnosis is wrong. This is going to pass. People may get a second opinion, talk about how things will be fine. It would be very common for people to reject social support. Because if there's nothing wrong, you don't need that support from people, or they may only accept social support from people who are willing to agree with them that this isn't right, that this isn't true. A challenge in this stage is that even when people want to help, the family may turn people away and say, you're making a bigger deal about this than you need to, and things like that. After the denial stage is the third stage, which is grief. So here, instead of the emotions of trying to avoid emotions or trying to control emotions, the focus is on things like anger and guilt and sadness. So people may be angry, asking, why is this happening? Why my family? Why my child? They may have guilt or blame for each other. So it may be that they feel guilty for not noticing sooner. They may feel like they're being punished. They may blame the other parent or something like that. And that blame could be right or wrong. This is just about what their emotional experience is. People may experience sadness, so bouts of helplessness or crying. People may need reassurance that they're doing their best. And this is where social support and support groups may be really, really helpful as people are grappling with these emotions. The next stage, the fourth stage, is called focusing outward. So instead of focusing inward on the family or on themselves, this is where people may start to seek information. So they're focusing outward in terms of seeking out the informational support that they need. They may seek out energy to try to tackle the illness or disability. Here's where people might want to talk over their treatment options. They would have increased awareness of reality, that this is an accurate diagnosis, that the diagnosis is permanent. Because people are focusing outward here, they may want to treat this like something that they can solve and think that tackling it head on will help it go away, or think that things may go back to the way that they were. So it's still a little bit unrealistic in that people may think that the issue is going to go away if they get the right information, get the right doctors, get the right support. But there is a little bit more acceptance in this stage than there was in previous stages. And then the last stage you can see is called closure. And this is where there is acceptance of the situation and of the child. Families realize that this is their new normal and recognize that their child has different needs than maybe other children or than what they had before. Here, they can really begin to meet the needs of that child and of the family because they fully accepted what's going on, because they decide this is how things are now and they can adapt to this new reality. Often families have increased solidarity in this stage because they are thinking that this crisis has made us stronger and more resilient. So that is an example of an unpredictable stressor and how families may deal with it. So why is it that families are so affected by things like caregiving or by an illness or disability? We talked about children as an example, but that could be true for any member of the family. And one important explanation for why this is so challenging for families as a whole is that families operate as systems. And this is the last thing that we'll really talk about today before you get to your readings. So when we talk about systems, this can help us understand why families are so deeply impacted by stress. So when we talk about families as systems, we mean that family members don't operate as individual members, but they operate as one larger thing. So there are 6 properties of systems that we're going to talk about that can help us understand why it is that families are so impacted by one family member's stress. So the first property is interdependence, and this says that family members are mutually dependent on each other. So what happens to one family member affects all of the other family members. So what affects one family member also affects other people. So if a child has an illness, because families are interdependent, everybody else is also going to be affected by that experience. The second property is wholeness, which says that to understand families, we have to look at them as a whole. As the family interacts, it is more than the sum of its parts. So it's not just a parent plus another parent plus a child plus another child. It is that when you add those things together, you get something bigger. So one really good example, one way to understand this property of wholeness is to think about baking a cake. When you have a cake, you have flour plus eggs plus sugar plus baking powder plus whatever else you put in a cake. Once you bake that cake, you get something totally different. So when you bite into a cake, you don't taste flour plus sugar plus eggs. You don't get all of those individual elements. You get something totally different. And that's the same principle that we mean when we talk about a family as a whole is different than just the sum of individual family members. So think about that cake metaphor when you think about wholeness. The third property is hierarchies, and this one says that the family system has levels. So there are different levels of power within the family. So parents often have more power than the children do, or within the siblings, there may be power from an older sibling versus a younger sibling. But you also have systems outside of the family. So a family exists within a neighborhood or a community, and then that community exists within a city or a state. And so you can kind of keep going out. Think of that as something looking like a target where you have the family in the center, and then you have all of these systems outside the family that impact what's happening in that family. Boundaries here on the bottom left, those are metaphorical barriers that separate levels of the system. So you can think of this metaphorically. So for example, you may have parents share information about finances with each other, but they don't share that information with their children. That's an example of a metaphorical boundary that separates the levels of the system. So you may have information that's shared only within certain levels, or you may have sort of privileges that separate levels of the system. So if you think about the family as tiers, there are things that separate people in the different tiers. Complex causality and punctuation and blame, these are a little bit trickier to understand. But complex causality says that it's really hard to nail down a cause and effect in the family because things are always sort of cycling. So for example, it may be that a child is acting out, and so the parent reacts to that acting out by punishing, and then the child starts to, so the parent is paying attention to the child by punishing them. So then the child sort of stops acting out because they're getting attention, and then the parent can stop paying attention to them because their child is behaving. So then when the child isn't getting attention, they act out again. So then the parent pays attention again. And so you kind of get this cycle, but it's hard to figure out whether the beginning of that was the child acting out or the parent not paying attention. So you get sort of this chicken and egg situation where you can't really nail down what exactly the beginning of the cycle is. And that's what we mean when we say complex causality, that it may look simplistic. This is happening because of this, but often the story is much more complex and nuanced than that. Punctuation and blame is related to that because that is the process of trying to pinpoint the start of a behavior. So if I'm trying to punctuate a behavior, then I say it starts with the child acting out, or it starts with the parent not paying attention to the child. So those two things are related, but complex causality is just the idea that things are more complex than they seem. Punctuation is the process of trying to nail down the cause of some kind of issue in the family. So the main point of this idea of families as systems is that patterns in families are very, very complex. So when we talk about a family, it's hard for us to ever say it's just about this one family member because families are interdependent. They are more than the sum of their parts. And then they have some of these other patterns that make it really tricky to kind of figure out what's happening in the family. But this may sort of shed some light on why it is that families are so affected by stress. So this week, as you continue to learn about family relationships and health, you have other tasks that you will complete. So first, you're going to complete 3 readings about family relationships. Some of those will focus particularly on stressors that families experience. So you can think about some connections to what you learned in this lecture. After you do those readings, you'll take the reading quiz. You'll participate in discussion, and when you do discussion, remember that you need to post 1 original post, and then you also need to post 3 replies to your classmates' posts. And then you'll also write a reflection essay this week. So thanks for listening to lecture. Remember that you can always contact me with questions if you have them, and I look forward to chatting with you more in the coming weeks.